I think we already have a good crowd here, quite a punctual bunch. Thank you so much. So in the interest of ending on time, I'm going to start us on time. And while people trickle in, let me go ahead and introduce myself and thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Novek. I'm a professor at NYU, currently on leave, serving at Northeastern University this semester, and director of the Governance Lab. And I'm delighted on behalf of the GovLab, Brookings, NYU DC that's hosting us here today, the Bradamus Center at NYU, and also our colleagues at the UChicago Harris Center for Effective Government, who've been very kind in displaying tremendous interest in this project. I am just thrilled that we can be here to celebrate this phenomenal new publication by GovLab Senior Fellow Paul Light, who is going to present today his latest research on what Americans want from government reform. I don't think Paul Light needs any introduction to people here. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. But let me just say, for those who need an update, Paul is NYU Wagner's Paulette Goddard Professor of Public Service and founding principal investigator of the Global Center for Public Service. He is also, of course, a senior fellow at the Governance Lab at NYU. Before joining NYU, Dr. Light served as the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow at Brookings and the founding director of its Center for Public Service and vice president and director of the Governmental Studies program at Brookings. He has served previously as the director of the Public Policy program at the Pew Charitable Public Trusts and associate dean and professor of public affairs at the University of Minnesota's Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs. He also has a long list of publications to his credit, which I won't go into today, but maybe Tom, you'll put Paul's bio in the chat for people who want to read more or order some of your books. But we're here today really to hear about this path-breaking work. It's both original research that Paul has conducted that he will tell you about, and analysis that he has done on a whole host of other empirical studies of American attitudes towards government and towards government reform, as we set about to embark on spending perhaps more money than we've ever spent since World War II, as we seek to build back better. The question is, can government do it? And what steps do we need to take to ensure that we are set up to be effective in our response to the tremendous challenges of our time? So with that, let me welcome Paul. And we will also put in the chat a link, not just to Paul's bio, but also to the full report that Paul is talking about today. You'll find a link in the chat. And for those who are joining us late, I will repost the link again so that you can take a look. Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth. And thanks to Tom McIntyre and the UDC or the NYU DC folks. Appreciate it all. This is a project that goes way, way back to the mid-1990s when the Los Angeles Times Center for the People and the Press came to the Pew charitable trusts looking for support after the LA Times went through another downsizing. The LA Times Center became the Pew Research Center. And in 1997, not with my urging, but built on the new Pew Research Center's instincts, started running a set of questions regarding the need for government reform. This was 1997 when Pew first asked the question of its respondents to say, well, given the following options, which do you prefer? Do you think the federal government needs very major reform? Do you think that it is basically sound and only needs some reform? Or do you think it doesn't need much reform at all? We've struggled over the years to define and understand what respondents were referring to as they answered that they wanted very major reform or they didn't think it needed much reform at all. But it's a long trend line that gives us purchase on what Americans are thinking about their peak institutions in Washington. We didn't ask about state governments, didn't ask about local governments, but this is a long trend line, and we're going to talk a little bit about it today with the latest update. Over the years, we've done I have done, separate from Pew, surveys asking this question and trying to figure out, well, what does it tell us? And I'm going to show you some slides here this morning, laying out the current state of public demand for reform. The good news is that the demand for very major reform has gone down. The bad news is that the number is still above 50%. So we'll be taking a quick look at some slides on this and talking about what's driving what. We're going to talk a little bit about the rising number of breakdowns, significant breakdowns, failures in the federal government that need to be repaired. The takeaway, if you will, at this point is that President Biden needs to talk about fixing government. We've got a lot of spending going on, and we're going to see a rapid increase in the number of de facto federal employees who work for the civil service, work for contractors, work for grantees. As we've pushed out a lot of funding, we've got more civil servants coming on the job, and that's useful and important. Nothing, needed more at this particular point, I think, in the federal government is a few more civil servants to handle the tremendous load. But we're going to go into that. And let me start with this first slide here. You can see it. This is the list of sort of what are the basic questions that we're asking. What do Americans want? Do they want very major reform, bigger, smaller government reform? What's driving demand, and so forth? So I want to show you this first chart here. It's, do Americans still want reform? The answer is yes, they do. The number has gone down. The number of Americans who say that the federal government needs very major reform has fallen since Trump left office. We're still above 50%, however, when you look at this trend line, the red line here, beautifully done by my colleagues at GovLab. We fell from 62% after Trump left office. In the wake of his departure, we fell down to 50%, and we're now inching up ever so slightly. A 2% increase in demand for very major reform. It is a statistical variation that's not very important, but it does signal what Tom Edson at the New York Times has called the abrupt and clear ending of the Biden honeymoon. That was in late July, early October, where we recorded that 52% mark in terms of demand for very major reform. And we see the percentage of Americans who say that the federal government only needs some reform. That is in second place at 38%. Overall, we see this continued demand for reform. We've got some data to present in just a minute or so about what Americans might be thinking as they say very major reform. Are they talking about system-wide change? The Harvard Kennedy School has some data on that, saying that Americans are favoring system change, but that data is a little bit old and may have been more about getting rid of Donald Trump than significant constitutional reforms. Any comments about that, my friend Beth?
Oh, sorry. Please keep going. Please keep going. I will.
Well, let's take a look here. I mean, when you actually ask Americans, our survey samples, what's driving their opinion?
But I will, Paul,
Yeah.
I'll use the interruption, which I wasn't expecting. Sorry, just to encourage people to please add their questions to the Q&A so that we can bring them into the discussion as soon as possible. But back to you, and then I will chime in.
Well, you can see here the large amount of a relationship across this demand for reform and traditional measures of public affect towards government. Americans are dissatisfied with the way things going. They think the federal government should play a major role in American life. That affects their demand for very major reform. They think the federal government is doing a poor job, is run by a few big interests, almost always wasteful and inefficient. That drives demand for very major reform. They believe the federal government can't be trusted to do the right thing. This is a wild pairing of questions that Pew did way back when, and we see run on occasion. there's not much that ordinary citizens can do to influence the government, but they do a better job than government if they did do something. It's this kind of constant turmoil here in these kinds of questions about dissatisfaction with how government works. There is valence here about, government's not doing what I think it should be doing. It's wasteful, it's inefficient. You get all sorts of things going on. This next slide, however, tells you about—
Maybe I could interrupt you here for a moment, since you invited this, to just ask you what's back of this a little bit, which you'll talk more about. But you have done a lot of work over the years about government failures and indeed about government ineffectiveness. Do you think, however, that this and the way that people are responding is genuinely a response to those failures, or is it a conflation of politics and politicians and bureaucracy? In other words, a dissatisfaction with politicians, a dissatisfaction with politics that masquerades itself as a dissatisfaction with government? Or is this genuinely, I'm unhappy that the line at the DMV is too long?
I think, honestly, when I look at this, and you kind of become this card reader, almost a crystal ball kind of effect. I think Americans, when they see something go wrong with the government, like the Afghan withdrawal, which President Biden called hard and messy, or messy and hard. I think Americans hope that the federal government is going to be able to deliver in those situations, but not surprised when it doesn't. The expectation is towards government somehow going to screw up, unless it's one of those prestige agencies, such as the Centers for Disease Control, which used to have a spectacular reputation in the kind of counts that we do from time to time about what Americans think of this organization or that organization, and has fallen quite dramatically during the pandemic and remains a not well-respected organization among the American public. I think there's a lot of ideology in here, the twin, the polarization that we see in the American public. It's almost like the government, when it does something well, does not get much credit. And when it fails, it's going to get maximum discredit, and that's going to pull us down. The real question I think we all need to confront from time to time here is, well, what can the federal government do better? Is it really an issue? Does Joe Biden need to have an agenda, rather like the Clinton agenda, designed to improve government performance, and at least to put it on the calendar as something that he wants to work on? I think he has to. I think he needs to. But I think the expectation among Americans right now is that the federal government is more likely to screw up than to perform. More of an aha, I can't believe it happened here kind of response when the federal government does get the vaccines out and does follow its protocols and moves forward. A little bit of a surprise in that regard. Expectations low for Americans. That help, Beth?
It does. You've already answered. I asked you about politicians versus bureaucrats, but Mort Downing in the Q&A asks you, so let me be very specific on this. Is the survey data specifically referring to the executive branch, or is this combining survey data about all three branches of government?
It's about the federal government generally. So, Mort, it's really not about the executive branch specifically, but when we get into this major reform, I'm thinking that it's less about Congress, and the framing of the question leads us towards more about the executive branch. That's my view of it, and the history has been that. The cost of surveys these days. We could take a look at it in some future survey, but I'd basically argue here that it's more executive weighted in terms of the kinds of questions we're asking. Make sense?
It does. Now, Timothy Manisia, and forgive me for mispronouncing names here, specifically asks you a question about the conflict between number 2 and number 6 on this slide. Is that something you want to get into now, or you'd like us to keep going? In other words, we want government to play a major role in fixing things, but we don't trust government to do the right thing. How do we have both of those at the same time? I think some of your scenarios may get to this in a moment, but I wanted to call out the conflict and the tension while we're still showing this slide.
There's clearly a great deal of partisanship in here. So it's a great catch on that one. Yeah, I often use this set of questions to show just how confused we are when we're asking questions about attitudes towards government. We get the question from Mort about whether this is about the executive branch or Congress or the courts. We get the question about number 2 versus number 6. I find number 7 and number 8 quite remarkable. The notion that ordinary citizens would do a better job solving problems, but simultaneously saying, nevertheless, I can't do much even if I did get the chance to do a better job. It's a complicated system. So we got a tangle in here, and in order to kind of pull it apart, we need a pretty sizable investment of funding for the survey work. The University of Michigan Institute for Survey Research continues to have the national resource surveys that help us get to this, but it's a complicated set of questions, and best used to illustrate how confused many of us are when we start thinking about whether government's doing a good job.
So we have lots more questions coming in about this slide, but I think I'm going to let you move forward, or we won't get to the rest of the conclusions, and I will bring in those other questions in just a moment.
Well, part of the answer on this one is in the second chart, where we see this persistent division between Americans who think that we should have a smaller government that delivers fewer services. This is a question that goes back 40 years, more or less, versus the number who say we should have a bigger government that delivers more services. And you can see we've got a lot of data points in the last 2 or 3 years. You can just see the tremendous polarizing tension that expresses itself in answers to this question. Yes, Joe Biden's agenda at this particular point, one could argue that it has a very slight majority support. 52% of Americans, we see Dems heavily weighted here, want the bigger government that delivers more services. And you have a very strong message here. In the red line, you've got the smaller government, fewer services. That's been rising with Biden. And in the orange line, you've got the bigger government, more services, about 8 points below. This is part of this polarizing effect. The Dems and Rs are going to be found nicely packed here. And this is a good expression of polar variance in the American public. We've got parallel findings from our friends at the American Enterprise Institute who have looked at these trends. We see the smaller government, fewer services, government doing too many things left to business. We see this deep polarization about what government does, and we see polarization around whether it does a good job more generally. Any questions about that, Beth, come up?
So I'll let you keep going here, and then I'll bring in some questions in just a moment.
Well, we have this typology here of 2 questions. One is, does the federal government need the major reform? That's question 1. And do you generally support a bigger government that delivers more services, or a smaller government that delivers fewer services? That creates a typology of 4 groups. The rebuilders, who say government should be doing more and it needs major reform. These are folks who really want government to get its act together. Down below to the bottom right, you have the streamliners. Basically, government's basically sound, needs only some reform, just make it a little bit smaller. And we have followed these questions over time. This particular slide that I'm showing here are relative statements from our political leaders. Al Gore, the Gore theme in reinventing government, a government that works better and costs less. That's really a rebuilder's attitude. We want it to work better. We want it to cost less. And we've got Biden as the expander in the Democratic Party. We must spend whatever it takes without delay. That's Biden's expansionist agenda. We've got two philosophies that we often find within the Republican mix. We've got the government should be active but limited, engaged, not overbearing. That's George W. Bush on streamlining. And then we've got Donald Trump as the ultimate dismantler. We will cut so much your head will spin. That is the dismantler's ideology. And when we combine these and follow them over time, we see that the number of expanders was very high back in 1997 when Clinton was in the presidency. 43% of Americans fell into that category. We want more of what government delivers, and we want it now. That number fell dramatically during later in the 1990s, dropped during the Great Recession, and has been inching back up. This orange here on this chart is really the expanders, and you can see Biden's coalition at the top right. You see the Trump coalition to the far left. That's just the way the computer decided to paint these corners. But you can see that Trump ran for office in 2016 with a very large cadre of Americans who wanted government to be taken apart, downsize, major reform, eliminate this, eliminate that, get control of the bureaucracy. So in 2016, when he launched his campaign, we have a 43% share of Americans who were saying, we favor this dismantling agenda. You see that number fall over time. And right now, October 2021, which is the current, the latest measures that we have, we see a contest between three of the four groups. We've got the dismantlers spoiling around Donald Trump, perhaps, for 2024. We've got the Biden expanders holding steady, but not a strong position, nowhere near a majority. And then we've got this debate between the streamliners and the rebuilders. The rebuilders are going to be more of a flavor here that will support Biden, while the streamliners are going to line up. If we see Trump run, we're going to see them line up to the left of this chart.
Let me ask
yes.
you here and bring in some of the questions that I'm
Sure.
seeing in the chat. If you go back a slide, just so we can see the typology here. What I like about the typology or taxonomy that you've created for describing this is that you're giving us multiple variables at the same time. On the one hand, this is addressing questions about the right size of government and the remit of government. It's also addressing a set of questions about government performance and government effectiveness. Now, it is, however, playing into a traditional antinomy that we see between the sort of big government and small government ideologies.
Right.
And I think, as you and I will get into in a moment, we see there as being a third way forward that is about better government and about more effective government. So I'm wondering really two things here. One is, in a way, does it help or hurt that we're kind of conflating issues about size, about spending, and about effectiveness at the same time? And what does the survey data really tell us about sort of where these different poles are? And two is, in what way and this is a question that's coming in the Q&A, you're also being asked, in what way, when these questions are asked, whether by you or by others, are we educating people about what we mean by government, what we mean by government performance? What does this gets back a bit to my question of, is this really about the line at the DMV? Is this about the performance of the CDC on mask guidance? Or is this about an ideological persuasion with regard to the big, small conservative, liberal divides in this country. So there's a lot going on here. And I think that actually is very helpful because these things are conflated. But I'm wondering both, how does the survey data again help us to disaggregate them, and what do you think about sort of using this traditional big small taxonomy? Are we doing a disservice to some extent to stay within that frame?
Well, I'll take the last question first. I think it's a disservice to break this apart and say, oh, it's the bigger versus smaller community here. Because I think what Americans are saying, and of course we become Svengalis kind of here. We're trying to get inside the minds of our respondents and figure out what they're saying. I'm going to make that, take advantage of that opportunity in your question to say that I don't think this is so much about big or smaller. There are deep partisan positions here that are well established in terms of what the Dems and what the Rs, what the liberals, what the conservatives want. What I see missing here is a persistent effort to get government to be effective in whatever it does. And that's where we head into the conversation about breakdowns. What I see in our data as a rising curve in breakdowns of government programs. Joe Biden certainly is now aware that breakdowns matter to his popularity, to his approval. But what we want to do is get away here from the bigger, smaller dichotomy to blend in the performance component, where we get the streamliners and rebuilders. The streamliners and rebuilders are saying more about how government works than the size of government. And you see them down the spine of this chart. I worry at this particular point in time for the Biden administration, and I would say the same thing about past Republican administrations, that there's not as much interest in government reform and repair as you need to reignite public support for government engagement on these big ticket issues that we're dealing with. We know how to spend money, but do we have the systems in place to assure accountability? And Joe Biden, long before he ran for president, was well known as an advocate of efficiency and accountability. The problem he faces now, post-Afghanistan, is continued concerns about whether the federal government can deliver on the promises it makes. One of my favorite quotes of recent months was from Paul Krugman, who said that Joe Biden was the big spender that Americans desperately want. I think that Biden also has to be the repairman that the federal government desperately needs. We've got systems breaking down. We've got technologies that aren't working well. We don't have congressional interest in reform. It's boring. It's hard. We haven't had reorganization authority for a president in decades now, dating all the way back to the 1980s. And we don't have anyone in the White House and very few in Congress who are talking about how to make government work effectively. Now, that's a naive kind of statement from the standpoint that for many Americans, having government work effectively is either smaller or bigger government. But at the same time, I worry that we're setting ourselves up over and over again for waves of breakdowns in programs that Americans desperately want to see turned into effective engines of repair. That's my general view of it.
You can let me know if you want to go forward, but a quick question that I think maybe you can respond to now, which is Paula Margolis asked if you have any further breakdown on the basis of gender or race, education level, party, etc. Are there further breakdowns of this particular data?
I mean, this data is easily sliced and diced, but it's a big hunk of data to work with. I haven't run those kinds of analyses over time. It's just a huge amount of data. Most of the data is quite available. What we have done in this particular chart and the government reform, the demand for government reform, is we're buying questions one or two at a time, and putting them on large surveys. We get demographics for sure. We get party identification as part of the packages. And we use impeccably valid survey methodologies with SSRS and other firms. But, you know, the amount of computing time and energy to actually break this down is formidable. We do see racialization of attitudes within this data. We see that your view of the sources of discrimination, you know, for Black Americans in that classic racialization question, we see variation within that, but there's so much going on here in terms of age and location, history, and so forth. That it's oftentimes it's difficult to break it down. It's a good question, you know, excellent question.
Let's let you move forward, and I will, with the indulgence of those who are asking questions, we'll get to them shortly, but we'll let you move forward. And
well, I do want to just get to what I call the breakdown curve. Now, you know, we have been following major government breakdowns for some time. We do this work looking at what a breakdown is. I'll show it to you here. We define a breakdown, my team, I define a breakdown as a specific failure that is featured in the news to significance. This is all based up top here on ongoing surveys of public interest in stories in the news. We define a breakdown as a specific failure that we can trace to a programmatic goal. Let's take the Shuttle Challenger accident. That's a specific failure. It was very highly followed. It was in the news for a fairly long period of time. It comes up still to this day, generates high levels of public news interest, and demands repair. And number 5, could have been prevented. We find evidence that the breakdown was not just a function of ambitious endeavor. It was a failure due to the lack of discipline, the lack of rigor. It could have been prevented. By that measure, we end up with this chart of government breakdowns dating back to George H.W. Bush. You can see the number skyrocketed under Donald Trump. He had 6 breakdowns in his first year. Joe Biden has had 6, possibly going on 7 this year. And Trump soared to 33 total. That's based on this definition, a specific failure in the news, heavily covered, that was in part caused by government action or inaction. So we have this particular project underway, trying to figure out what causes breakdowns in the federal establishment. Can we explain what's going on? And how do we get to the question of vulnerability? What should a president do to address this curve? And is the curve established enough to demand action on it? Now, the 24 projected breakdowns during Biden's first term is based entirely on his first year, 1 breakdown per quarter, basically. That's a projection, but the Trump 33, the Obama 8 over his first term, and back on down, these are real breakdowns that were in the news. We think, or I think, the breakdowns undermine public confidence in government and trigger some of the earlier effects that I presented, the demand for very major reform. And that's part of the next piece of this puzzle. What can you do to reduce the breakdowns, their effects on public opinion, and improve government's reputation in part by assuring that it does its job well? And we end up with a number of threats to government performance right now: the baby boom retirements, the continued technology problems in the federal government. We're asking a lot of government right now, and yet we have not done a major government repair initiative now dating back into the early 1990s. We just have not been working on making government work from a bureaucratic and operational standpoint. That's the current trend, and I'll just take you through. These are all lists of government breakdowns that ended up in our accounts, my accounts. And what you see on the far right of this table is the percent of Americans who said they were closely following these stories, whether it's the delays in pandemic relief, the continued fentanyl opioid epidemic. Biden to date, we count 6 breakdowns that were in the news, heavily covered, clearly reflected government breakdown of some kind. And we see the large amount of public interest in following those stories. And that's one indicator, perhaps, that the federal government needs to improve. Breakdowns are oftentimes a natural result of ambitious endeavor, but many of the breakdowns that we see on these lists are just simple accidents, failures of competence, failures of policy design, demands, pressures, corruption, misconduct, turnover. We need to really take a close look at whether the federal government is as strong and well positioned to deliver on the promises that it makes as it should be. That's the last big piece of this presentation. One last chart I want to show you is the effect of government performance on Joe Biden's standing, public approval. We see here in June 2021 and October 2021 that Biden lost ground, in part because of the Afghan withdrawal. We've seen that before. We've had a lot of writing and a lot of conversation about it. But what's interesting is during the period that Biden loses strength between last June and October, we see the federal government gaining strength. It's kind of interesting to note that Biden's decline in approval, it wasn't large, but it was significant. I suppose that's a little bit of a mix, but statistically significant it was. What's interesting is that as Biden's approval fell, approval for the federal government inched up. I'm totally interested in hearing what some of you might think about that. You can see that Biden's job rating in October clearly related to those 4 types of reform positions. The dismantlers don't think much of Joe Biden. The expanders think much more highly of him. But even there, the expanders would like to see better, more effective government. Let's see what's on the minds of our callers here and partners.
So we have another set of questions a little bit related to my earlier question of conflation between bureaucrats and politicians. And Peggy Kershak really asks about federal versus state. So she has a set of questions here about whether we're not blaming the federal government for failures at the state level. A lot of course, direct service delivery to citizens happens by states. And so there's a tremendous conflation again and lack of understanding about what does the federal government do, what do states governments do,
Right.
And in what way can we get at or understand anything about attitudes, or can you tell us anything about attitudes towards state or local government? I mean, typically we think of people as trusting their local government more, This speaks to the federal government and the executive branch specifically, but
Right.
is there anything you can
Right.
tell us about the state and local perspective here?
Well, we've got so many competing pressures here. The pandemic and its effect on attitudes towards government, big breakdown at the federal level with the vaccination rollout, continued problems that we see. But, there is polling at the state and local level, and there is some data out there, but I need to acknowledge where I'm focused. I'm looking here at national level data, and I haven't seen much on this set of issues that would be comprehensive. It's been a long time since we've had a major national commission taking a look at state and local, but I'm not the person that's tracking it at this given point. So there are people working on this issue, but I really can't tell you much about it. Good question. Important set of issues as to whether government, state and local government is measuring up at this given point, given all the pressure that we're seeing throughout the system.
So Paul, you have a question in the chat also about going deeper on the work on government failure. I'm going to put some links in the chat for people, but maybe you could orally just point us to some work that you've done and others you want to point us to on the government failure question.
Well, we issued, meaning I guess I did a report in 2015 titled Vision plus execution, or vision plus performance equals faithful execution. I'm looking for it right now. It can be searched at the Volcker Alliance, VOLCKER. Just search for Volcker Alliance. Look at the publications and you'll see the vision plus execution studies that we did. We took a look at many of these failures and tried to understand what went wrong. Was it a failure of policy? Did we dream too large? Was it a design that just couldn't work? Was it a failure of operations? We didn't put enough staff on it. We didn't have the technologies for it. Was it a problem of corruption or misconduct or turnover at the political layers of government? It's very difficult when you look at a specific failure, as you look at something like Challenger, or you look at others of these significant breakdowns at the federal level. We can also see them at state and local. It's very difficult to figure out, well, what was the specific cause that led to the Waco standoff? What was the specific cause and effect? What could we have done differently? So there is some work that we've done to try to categorize the cause of some of these breakdowns. And I'd go to the Volcker Alliance and just go to their publications. You'll see some work that I've done published there. And we can go further in that regard.
Fantastic. I've begun to put some links in the chat, but I'll enlist Tom's help in adding some of those additional links to share with people. So there's, again, many more questions coming in here about sort of getting nitty-gritty on the data. I want to just check in with you if you have more slides you want to show us, or we can push to also talking about what we do about this in a minute. So before I take us down a rabbit hole here, tell us where we are, and if you have some patience to take a few more questions about the data here specifically.
Absolutely delighted to take more questions. I like this chart that we're ending on here on whether Americans trust Joe Biden to fix government. And you see the coloration of attitudes by your ideology. It's not clear to me that Joe Biden will ever catch a break with the dismantlers. He's just not bringing that fire to the conversation. He's not talking about taking down units of government. There may be at some point in the administration some sort of government reform effort, perhaps led by the coronavirus czar Jeff Zients, who has done this work during the Obama administration as well. But I don't see Joe Biden coming along and saying it's time for dismantling. I suspect that Joe Biden's reform agenda might be found somewhere in streamlining. Those are folks who are saying we'd like more of what government does, but we'd like repairs. The thing that, from my perspective on this issue, is my position on this issue, is that the Biden administration needs to take a look at the damage done to government performance over the last 10 years, dating back to Trump's entry into the conversation, just the end of time, the running out of the clock during the Obama administration. Many of us can still remember, those of us who work in this arena, that the Obama administration went to Congress. Obama went to Congress personally and asked for restoration of the president's reorganization authority, which had been phased out after the Supreme Court determined that the way the reorganization authority had been designed was unconstitutional. This was back in the mid-1980s. Obama goes to Capitol Hill and says, let's work on a constitutionally valid approach to doing the reorganization and the flattening of the hierarchy that needs to be done. And the answer from the Republican House was absolutely not. We can't do it. Biden was on Capitol Hill arguing for it at the time, but it was really Obama pushing, and Obama finally says, this ain't going anywhere. There's no point to it. We're never going to get the House to agree. Look, it's time for Biden and his supporters and the executive branch to see whether they can get some action on this kind of repair agenda. I really think it's an important issue for them to address, especially as we go forward into further policy designs, further promises about what we can deliver. I think Joe Biden needs the protection of a reform package that might have some strength on Capitol Hill, and he could get it done perhaps.
So I want to make sure we save enough time to talk more about the what do we do about this, but you're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A, which I'll invite you also to take a look at, that really get to the question of bias in asking about government failure. So there's two sets of questions kind of coming in here. One is, isn't the asking about government failure sort of presupposing the answer, essentially failing to ask about government successes, of which there are plenty? Yeah. And aren't we pushing people in this direction? And a related question, I think also, which is questioning some of the terminology, in that the person asked the question, is dismantlers aligning sort of I mean, you're showing a lot of correlation between party affiliation and the dismantler concept, but in fact, the military only grew under Trump and spending only grew under Trump. So again, aren't we falling into some pre-existing kind of antinomies as between the big, small, left, right, and we're just going to keep perpetuating this cycle if we don't move outside of this way of describing things?
Well, I'm fond of this is my favorite cover of all time, not a bestseller. This was a project that we did called Government's Greatest Achievement. We did a survey of economists and political scientists, and there'll be some pushback on which group to ask. We went through the major statutes that were enacted between the 1950s and the 2010, more or less. And we asked these economists and political scientists to tell us what we did right. Instead of Paul Light doing yet another report on government's greatest breakdowns, what do we know about what government did well, and why did it succeed, and what happened to it? I think that there was more damage done by Trump than perhaps suspected in this conversation. There wasn't much that he didn't try to break. and he compressed the budget. Yes, he did spend a great deal on defense. There were increases in specific programs that he liked, but there was a lot of damage done. And I think that we need to take seriously what's happening to the federal workforce and so forth as we go forward. But I'm in favor of looking at government achievements. We tend to look at government breakdowns because they get so much visibility, and we like to prevent them. We really do want to figure out what might be causing what appears to be an acceleration in breakdowns over recent years. Could it be the baby boomers? Could it be technology? So forth and so on. One thing that I think Joe Biden has learned here in the last 6 months is that fixing government, especially in the case of fixing the Internal Revenue Service, is a source of funding. And maybe he can take that forward. It's a good thing for government just from public confidence, but Joe Biden figured out that you can make money from making the IRS work better. It was damaged over the years, in part to keep it from working well. Anyway, glad to talk a little bit further about this.
It's with the last few minutes that we have left, and I would encourage people who still have questions to ask them in the Q&A. Let's delve a little bit deeper into this, what to do about it.
Yeah.
So to some extent, and this gets to a question in the Q&A about whether this is really a media perception issue, right?
Yes.
Negative stories make for better headlines. Is this an issue about fixing media perception of government and media reporting on government breakdown and failure? Because that's what people love to talk about. Nobody does news stories about, how a veteran got their benefits and got health care. Nobody does stories about how the line at the DMV was short. Is this a media issue, or are there, to your last point, are there ways in which we should be addressing better delivery of citizen services, in which case this may very well be an issue at the state and local level that the federal government needs to attend to?
That's a great question. I have a footnote in one of these in the document that you all published, talking about the news interest methodology that we deployed to say, well, what is a breakdown, and what is the level of demand for evidence to say, well, this was a federally caused or contributor. I mean, by definition, space flight is dangerous. People get killed. It's fraught, but are there situations where there are very clear indications that government didn't do its job? So we're aware of this. I worried that part of the polarization we see in our political world affects the news media, that when you've got a Democrat in office, perhaps the conservative media spins up its engines to take a look at every mistake and scale it to a significant public event. Is it the same thing during a Republican president? Is it CNN spinning up its engines to show that Trump did this, that he manipulated that, and so forth and so on? It's a very useful cautionary position for your questioner to present. I worry about it, but I'm trying to figure out, well, can we get traction on looking for commonalities across breakdowns? Is it the people in the civil service? Is it the retirements? Is it the technology? Is it the expectations? And I do agree on this need to talk about when government does well, and it does well quite a bit. And that's something that we can all embrace as we go forward.
Wonderful. So we are just about at the end of the hour. So let me ask you, where do you go from here with this work? What's not done yet? What are the questions you haven't asked that you still want to ask? And where do you take this work?
Well, the questions that our listeners have been asking are on point. I mean, how do we take the measure of government performance? Is it in public opinion, which is so sensitive to partisanship in these hyper-polarized times? I mean, how do we actually get an agenda going? Do we need more blue ribbons? Do we need more commissions of one kind or another? This project early on was supported by the Volcker Alliance and is still embraced by the Volcker Alliance. Paul Volcker, during his lifetime, was a tireless supporter of government reform and government improvement. He passed away in 2019. His memory is clear and active in the Volcker Alliance. But where do we get the next tranche of fair evaluations of how government can perform better? We've got lots of organizations like the Partnership for Public Service, the National Academy of Public Administration, and so forth, working on this. But policy has to be part of this as well. Are we designing policies that can be effectively implemented? I don't really know where we go from here, but I think there's a growing sense that we need to take some further action to address the weaknesses in our systems for delivering on faithful execution of the laws.
So Paul, let me also invite you to take a last look at what's in the Q&A to see if in the last 3 minutes there's anything that you really want to grab onto that we haven't talked about. In parallel, what we will do is, for those who joined us late, we've posted a number of your links and publications in the chat, and we will repost the link to the report for those who want to dive in a little bit deeper and see the basis for the survey work, both by you and by others. I think for us at the Governance Lab, we were thrilled to have and honored to have the chance to collaborate with Brookings on publishing this report. Because for us, we are centrally focused on the question of how to improve government effectiveness, especially by using technology, data, and the wisdom of our communities. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to upskill and invest in public sector capacity, and feel as you do that there is a great yawning gap in how we're addressing government modernization. Even as we're talking about building back better, we have a desperate need now to invest in greater talent, better processes, more infrastructure, and better systems that actually can address these questions of how do we serve citizens better across branches of government and across layers of government. So I think there's a lot that we can do in this regard. It's just very curious and problematical to the extent to which these debates between Republicans and Democrats about the right size of government have really caused, especially I think the Democratic Party, to want to stay far away from the issue of government modernization. Talking about government is the third rail. It's really the third rail because government is considered so unpopular. But after COVID, well, we hope after COVID, in the midst of COVID, I think we truly hope that the attention that this kind of work is bringing to this issue is something that might really cause a renewed focus. And there is, for many parts of government, GSA and its Government Modernization Fund, lots of work through groups like 18F or the United States Digital Service. There are efforts to improve performance in significant ways, but it's not something we tend to hear much about, that gets talked about, and that's not part of the vision for what we do. So with that, let me see if there's anything else you would like to respond to that's come in, or any closing words from on your side.
It's a beautiful summary, Beth, and thank you for pulling it together. There are icons of excellence on the reform agenda. The Government Accountability Office remains a stellar producer of ideas and insights on how to make government work. What we're missing right now, perhaps in the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, which is now thoroughly focused on Homeland Security, and over in the House on government affairs, We need more energy focused on making sort of the basic investments that used to be of concern to those committees. That to me is a big weakness. Nobody in Congress, well, there are somebodies in Congress, but who is really caring about these issues right now? And can we get a focus or find any common ground? Your peroration here is very useful. You're in command of it, and I'm so happy to be involved with GovLab in this effort. Beautiful work, a wonderful group of people, and of course, you know, Beth, you have been a true champion of this work. So thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. We won't keep people late from their lunch. Thank you to NYU DC for hosting us, and to the Bradamus Center, Brookings, U Chicago, Harris School, and of course to the GovLab and its team for producing the report. And to Paul, congratulations. And we look forward to continuing the conversation about what Americans want from government reform. Thank you to everybody, and we will post a video of this on the GovLab site. We'll tweet it out and we'll share it on YouTube. You'll be able to find it online later.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.